Alright guys, how's it going? Last week I said December would be a relaxing month for me, then I went on to release the massive Ryzen and Navi leak. Suffice it to say that it's not been at all relaxing. Now that video was unsurprisingly shared throughout the tech press, most of them simply paraphrased without offering much of an opinion, but there were one or two that felt the rumours were just too good to be true. I'll end the video on that too good to be true note, but I'll start it by going over to one of the websites who vehemently disagreed with my leaks, and I'll analyse their reasoning why. At Extreme Tech and their article, the latest rumours about AMD's Ryzen 3000 series are too good to be true. A new set of rumours from AdoredTV suggest a CPU lineup from AMD that's simply too starry-eyed to take seriously. The initial claim is that AMD will use the same chiplet and I/O strategy that it's deploying for 7nm's EPYC with Ryzen as well. AMD used that same die design for both EPYC and Ryzen in its first generation of products, so this could be what the company chose to do again, but it seems unlikely. Given that AMD's 14nm die is built at GlobalFoundries, while its 7nm chiplets are built at TSMC, there's a cost to splitting the work into two separate sections. With EPYC, the cost is obviously worth the benefit. It's not clear that Ryzen would benefit in anything like the same way, however. Now, let me be honest, having doubts about the economics of a 14nm consumer I/O die is completely understandable. I've been having the exact same doubts for weeks, hence why I keep on changing my mind over its likely composition. At first I thought it must be a quarter of the EPYC I/O die. Then I thought it must be a smaller consumer-focused I/O die covering a lot of segments, perhaps as part of the game console strategy. Essentially, this all comes down to economics, and how to make that worth it. What I've really been trying to do over these past few weeks is justify the same 7nm Zen 2 chiplet being used everywhere, from EPYC to Ryzen and even the game consoles. And if that same 7nm chiplet is being used, then they'll all require an I/O die of some description. But regardless of that seemingly making great sense from the perspective of yield, reuse and economies of scale, it's difficult to escape the reality that having the Ryzen chiplets fabbed at TSMC and the I/O die fabbed at GlobalFoundries simply makes no sense for these cheaper parts. You're talking two entirely different parts of the world, New York and Taiwan, and both the parts would have to come together to be packaged elsewhere. Every step of that process is extra cost. On enterprise and high-end desktop silicon like EPYC and Threadripper, that's not a problem. But on $99 MSRP silicon, it probably is. One chiplet from TSMC, one dummy die, also presumably from TSMC, one 14nm I/O die from GlobalFoundries, all being sent to another packaging facility elsewhere, and everybody on the route wants paid? How much change is left out of $99 after that? Note that the existence of this 14nm I/O die is, however, all my own speculation. The video clearly points that out at 4 minutes 40 seconds. My leak made no mention whatsoever of an I/O die, so I'm not quite sure why that was taken as fact here. But that did have me somewhat intrigued, as I had asked my leaker for more information on the I/O die after I launched the video. Their response being, "I don't know for sure, but I believe there is no I/O die for Ryzen. It's just much smaller 7nm chiplets instead." Now that had me really surprised, clearly, as I hadn't even thought to ask them about the I/O die in all the previous 17 email discussion. On the same day, one of my EPYC leakers got back to me with this information. The next Ryzen parts will only be based on 7nm. And finally, a third source told me this a day or two later. I only saw one I/O chip in production at GlobalFoundries and it was huge. So with all of that, I feel it's quite clear. First of all, my Ryzen I/O die theory looks stone cold dead. Or it's being made at TSMC on 7nm. Second is that my current leaker appears to be in agreement with another two leakers who have been correct about everything else in the past. What does that mean? I guess Occam's razor says consumer Zen 2 is likely a monolithic die, just like Ryzen 1, with integrated memory controller and everything else. It's just a very small CPU. There comes a point when theories need to get thrown out, and this one is past that point now, as far as I'm concerned. A quick shift of website over to TechSpot and Tim, who also disagreed with the leaks, labelling them, of course, as too good to be true, and failing the common sense test. Much of the early part of the article centred on the pricing of the Navi GPUs, which I'll discuss near the end of this video, but for now, we'll stay with Ryzen and this. Take, for example, the Ryzen 7 3700X. This is claimed to be a 12-core part with a 4.2 GHz base clock, 5 GHz boost clock at 105 watts. But if we look back at second generation Ryzen, the Ryzen 7 2700X is also a 105 watt part, but only includes 8 cores, a base clock of 3.7 GHz, and a maximum boost of 4.3 GHz. So the leak is essentially claiming that 3rd gen Ryzen is providing 4 extra cores plus an additional 500 MHz on the base clock within the same 105 watt power envelope. So 50% more cores and a 14% higher base clock. And Tim finishes this passage with, now we have to remember what AMD said at their Zen 2 unveil, that 7nm is allowing them to achieve upwards of 1.25 times the performance at the same power consumption. So does it sound realistic that AMD would be able to put in 50% more cores and clock them all 14% higher within the same TDP? And yes, that 1.25 times performance at the same power slide was indeed shown at Next Horizon, but it doesn't mean what you think it means, Tim. Let me explain. At the same event, we saw a slide showing how Rome has twice the throughput, and at the end we heard Lisa Su saying that Rome was basically twice as fast as Naples. Later on at a nearby event, they showed 64 Rome cores up against 64 Naples cores, as well as Skylake SP. The difference of course being Naples was 2 socket, while Rome was 1 socket. 1 socket versus 2 sockets in this context basically means half the power. And we see that in the same slide. Same performance at half the power. So with that in mind, what would happen if you added another Rome chip into the second socket? You'd now have twice the number of cores of Naples and twice the performance of Naples at the same power. In other words, Rome is twice as fast as Naples at the same power, not 1.25 times as fast. 1.25 times the performance at the same power means 1.25 times the clock speed at the same power. How do I know that? I know because of this slide here showing a tale of two Vegas. We can see this shaded sweet spot range where you can go from 50% lower power at low clock speeds, frequency down the bottom, or you can take higher performance, again frequency, at an increasing power cost. So if we just compare this 14nm MI25 to the new 7nm MI60, we can see that AMD has even included the clock speeds. 1.8 GHz is 20% faster than 1.5 GHz. And at this power level, with the 14nm Vega MI25 at 1.5 GHz, if we just draw a line across that, we can see that Vega MI25 does 1.8 GHz at slightly less power. Up around here though is around the 275 to 300 watts of power. So 105 watts of power will be around about here. There is of course a difference between CPU and GPU architectures, but hopefully what I'm trying to say makes sense. Just as Rome has twice the cores at around the same power as Naples, the Ryzen 3000 series will have twice the cores at around the same power as the Ryzen 2000 series. Alternatively, you can use all the power budget 7nm brings by keeping the same core count and increasing clock speeds by 25% or so. This is essentially what AMD did with Vega MI60. They kept the same 64 compute units, the same 4096 shaders, and simply used all of the 7nm power budget to increase clocks by 20%. Almost completely maximising the clock speeds. Another alternative though would be a halfway approach. Instead of doubling the core count or maximising clocks, why not use half the power budget on 50% extra cores and the other half gets spent on half the extra clock speed budget? And there you have the result. 4 extra cores plus an additional 500 MHz on the base clock within the same 105 watts power envelope. 50% more cores and 14% more speed. It's not magic. And before you ask me why the R5 3600 isn't 25% faster than the 2700X, that's because you're comparing a mid-range chip to the current high-end Ryzen, and these R5s of the upcoming generation are also 2 CPUs, not 1, which I said in the leak video, so there will be a loss of efficiency here too. And that's why it's a 95 watt TDP chip. But getting back over to Extreme Tech, and the real problem with these claims, however, lies in the number of cores and clocks AdoredTV believes AMD will ship. The table below is courtesy of overclock3d.net. Normally I don't spend time on debunking bad rumours, but these are egregiously bad. First, it's highly unlikely that AMD would kill off its entire product family below the 6-core and SMT space, or that it would stop using SMT as a feature differentiation in its products. And once again, I agree with Joe, that is highly unlikely. Of course, AMD also has Athlon and the A-series chips below the current Ryzen 3s, which would be a perfect fit for, say, 6-core, 6-thread CPUs, or maybe even 4-core, 8-thread CPUs. There's nothing being killed off, it's all being shifted down a tier. Isn't that clear just by looking at the lineup? And the previous Ryzen 7s are now Ryzen 5s. So clearly the previous Ryzen 5s are now Ryzen 3s, and what previously were Ryzen 3s can shift down to the real budget offerings and brands. Looking at the Reddit leak, and you can see AMD's thinking with their planned Ryzen 5 3400X. 4 cores, 8 threads, 3.8 GHz base and 4.2 GHz boost. And sure, it's actually $20 more than the Ryzen 3 3300, which is actually quite a lot in this segment. But this 4-core 8-thread chip could also be around 20% faster than a 6-core 6-thread 3.2 GHz base clock 3300. And there's also the matter of the 2400G, which on the Reddit leak had been rebranded as the Ryzen 5 3500G. Again, it's 4 cores and 8 threads, with integrated Vega 11 graphics. But if those Ryzen 3 SKUs, especially the Ryzen 3 3300G and its glacial clock speeds, if these chips didn't have SMT, then they would likely be slower than the current 2400G. 4 cores, 8 threads and 6 threads, that's roundabout even in performance. Yet the older technology has higher clock speeds. But Joel goes on to say, AMD already offers SMT on most of its Ryzen CPUs, but leaving it off the lowest end models is an upsell technique. I'm fairly certain having 2 more cores at higher clock speeds is also an upsell technique. And of course, I also said in the video that I would bet my backside on that $99 one being a 50 watts locked part. Upselling is obviously a thing, but so is just selling, period. Think about all those people still with quad cores. You think they're interested in a 6-core, 6-thread 3300 at lower clock speeds? Even at $99, I don't think they would be. You also need to consider what Intel has to compete with. Any Intel quad core with hyperthreading will crush this CPU if it only has 6 cores and 6 threads. For Intel, you're talking 4 GHz base clock minimum. That's easily gonna beat a 6-core, 6-thread Ryzen 3. But if Intel needs to use their own 6-core, 12-thread parts to compete with these Ryzen 3 parts, what are they competing with in the mid-range and then the high-end? They can't compete everywhere, it's such a huge core count disadvantage. But continuing on with second, the closest CPU to the claimed Ryzen 3 3300X is the current Ryzen 5 2600X. Which has a 3.6 GHz base and a 4.2 GHz boost clock, costing $240. The chances that AMD slashes its equivalent CPU pricing by 54% on the basis of 7nm improvements is nil. There are 2 glaring issues with this. First of all is that the predecessor of the 2700X, the 1800X, was a $499 CPU, while the 2700X was a $329 CPU 1 year later. And if you just whip out the calculator, 100 divided by $499, the original price of the 1800X, and we multiply that by 329, which was the launch price of the 2700X, and we've got a 66% slashing of price without any 7nm improvements. Yet for some reason, nobody thought the chances of that happening were nil. So why did that happen? Simple. It happened because back when AMD launched the 1800X, Intel had no decent competition in their consumer desktop near that price point, as they were limited to the 4 cores and 8 threads Kaby Lake i7 7700K. 1 year later, they had the far more competitive 8700K to combat the 2700X, and AMD had to come in at a much lower price point. The second glaring and most problematic issue with this is the use of the word equivalent, which betrays Joel's flawed thought process. The big giveaway is in the branding. One is a Ryzen 3 and the other is a Ryzen 5. It doesn't matter that they both have similar core counts and clock speeds. What matters is the branding. The equivalent CPU to the Ryzen 5 2600X is in fact the Ryzen 5 3600X. 2 more cores and 11% higher clock speeds at $10 less, on the basis of 7nm improvements. You have to understand that there are a lot of factors in play here regarding segmentation and pricing, but the most important one is that people buy based on their ability to afford something. I've read and listened to some nonsense recently about nobody will buy the Ryzen 5s with the Ryzen 3s so cheap and offering 12 threads. That is absolute horse shit. People buy based on their ability to afford something. I'll use myself as an example. At my current wealth, or lack thereof, I decide I'm going to build a new Ryzen 3000 gaming PC, and let's say I'm looking at a GPU maybe around the RTX 2070 to the RTX 2080 level. If I look at the entire leaked Ryzen lineup and figure out how much I can realistically afford on a CPU for my new build, do you think I'm going to buy a Ryzen 3 3300, even though I know that in the vast majority of games, at 1440p, it'll be more than enough? Of course not. I'd be looking to get at least a 3600X, and more likely would end up with the 3700X. I was upsold simply because I can afford it and it looks like the smarter option. If I can't afford it, I can't afford it. In which case, I'll bet the 3300 looks mightily compelling against whatever product Intel currently has at these same price points. Next up at Extreme Tech was a part on the new integrated GPUs and their memory bandwidth. I found this one interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all was that, again, I actually agreed that having 20 compute unit graphics didn't seem very likely. In fact, I asked my leaker about that before I even had launched the video, and they got back to me with this. It seems that integrated GPUs have been massively improved on the desktop to make them more compelling, justifying the price and series numbering increases from 200G to 300G for the Ryzen 3 lineup and from 400G to 600G for the Ryzen 5 lineup. And also, it may just be that 15 and 20 CUs are the target goal as of this moment. That's typically the case up until 3 months or so prior to launch. But what's doubly interesting is that I was told this by my leaker, not only before I had launched my video, but before I had made them aware of the second leak over at Reddit. You know, that same leak which also had 20 compute units for the 8-core 16-thread Ryzen 5 3600GX. What is the chances of that? Rather than focusing on the improbability of having a 20 CU graphics APU, the focus here should have been on the improbability of 2 separate sources coming to the same conclusion independently, without there being at least some truth behind it. That was the important thing here, not the fact that it may be memory bandwidth bottlenecked. Next up was a real head-slapping moment. The clock speed and core count targets off the top of the stack reflect exceedingly wishful thinking, not reality. An 8-core chip with 1280 on-die GPU cores and a 4GHz clock in a 95W TDP at $199? And he is, of course, talking about the Ryzen 5 3600G. That's the equivalent of an RX 560 GPU, as far as core count goes, slapped down alongside a Ryzen 7 2700 at 3.2 GHz base, 4.1 GHz turbo and $269. The cheapest RX 560 on Newegg is $104. Again, there's simply no way that AMD is going to sell an APU with an onboard GPU at what amounts to a 53% price cut. Okay, let's start with perhaps the most obvious part here. This isn't the top of the stack, Joel. It's the mid-range. Think branding, not current core counts. I even wrote mid-range on the table so people didn't get confused. The cheapest RX 560 on Newegg is $104, is it? No, $105. Okay, let's have a look at it then. Now, what can we see? Oh yeah, there's 4GB of GDDR5. I wonder how much that costs. Then there's the PCB, there's a fan and a shroud, and there's a bunch of connectors. There's the fact that presumably Power Color want to get paid for putting all this together. Newegg will for sure want a cut. And all the guys transporting the parts back and forth. So that's $104 worth of graphics card, of which AMD only gets paid for the graphics chip. The RX 560 is 123 square millimeters built on GlobalFoundries 14nm and is the full, or near enough full, Polaris 11 GPU. This 1280 on-die GPU cores is likely to be half of a complete Navi 12 GPU, which we believe to have 40 compute units. The RX 360, I've been told, is 32 compute units, with the RX 370 being the whole 40 compute units. So all those slow and heavily defective Navi 12 dies, with 20 compute units, they get thrown together with the slowest Ryzen 5. Remember, the clock speeds of this are on par with the Ryzen 3 3300, 3.2 GHz base and 4 GHz boost. It just has 2 extra cores, and together they cost $200. And according to Joel, this chart reads as though someone heard that 7nm offers a theoretical 50% increase in density, and assumed that 100% of that improvement would, or could, be translated into price. Well, I guess now is a great time to go over to my old favourite, the die per wafer calculator. We don't know what size Navi 12 is, but let's just guess at 140 square millimeters. So we'll call that 14 by 10. 300mm wafer, of course, and on TSMC's current new process, we'll go with 0.4 defects on the wafer. Damn, that is a lot of defective dies. The full Navi 40s are only 58.63% of the wafer. That's assuming that they're fast enough too, of course, not just defect free. And obviously, the vast majority of those defective dies should be more than good enough for either the RX 3060 with 32 compute units or the 20 compute unit Navi APU. With this kind of salvaging, you're looking at 95% plus yield. So let's take that over to the silicon cost calculator. Right, so 140 square millimeters, 95% yield, and we'll go with a wafer price of currently $12,000, which is an awful lot for a wafer. But that is 7nm, and as you can see, the overall cost for every die on that wafer is $28. Every Navi 12 die, $28 each. That's how much these actually cost AMD right now on what is basically the brand new 7nm process. Not $104. Remember though, the Ryzen 5 3600G is a full 8-core chiplet. It has to be because it's 8 cores and it's also got the APU. So this full 8-core chiplet must be defect free. However, looking at the clock speeds, 3.2 GHz and 4 GHz boost, this is bottom of the barrel stuff. So the worst complete CPU chiplet and the worst GPU chiplets combined together at $200. Does that really seem like exceedingly wishful thinking now that I've pointed that out? This entire APU package will cost well under $50 to AMD, and they're selling it for $200. But moving on, and the upper CPUs all receive unrealistic price cuts. Wait, what? AMD's current fastest consumer desktop CPU, the 2700X, costs $330. I can quite clearly see looking at this list, and even the one that he brought over from OC3D, that there are 2 new chips costing an awful lot more than that and another chip at the same cost. I think perhaps there could be a giveaway here in the naming too. Ryzen 7 2700X, Ryzen 7 3700X. There's something there telling me that one of these parts is the replacement for the other. So rather than the upper CPUs all receiving unrealistic price cuts, what's really happened is AMD has created a new Ryzen 9 brand and raised prices by 52%. Back up to $500 mind. back to where they were when the 1800X launched, back when Intel had no decent competition near that price. It's the exact same situation as before. 8-core 16-thread Ryzen 1800X versus the 4-core 8-thread i7 7700K. It's the exact same thing again, except we've got double the core count now. Next up, and this one. It makes no sense that moving from 3.2 GHz base clock to 3.5 GHz on 6-core chips would require an additional 15 watts of TDP, but moving from 3.9 GHz to 4.3 GHz base clock on 16 cores would require just an additional 10 watts of TDP. So he's talking about the difference between the 3300 and the 3300X, 15 watts of TDP, and then the difference between the 3800X and the 3850X for 10 watts of TDP. I'm not going to get into the whole TDP thing. It is just a really bad argument. But what I will do is simply point to some Intel examples as a comparison point. Here we have the i5-8600 and a 3.1 GHz base clock with 65 watts TDP. Next we have the i5-8600K. The same 6 cores and 6 threads, but this time we're now up to a base frequency of 3.6 GHz at 95 watts TDP. So for 500 MHz base clock increase, it's an additional 30 watts TDP? And here's where it gets downright bizarre, because if you now look at the i7-8700K, 6 cores but now 12 threads at a base frequency of 3.7 GHz, and still 95 watts TDP, that seems almost like a miracle in comparison. Until you look at the i7-808 6K, the same 6 cores and 12 threads, but now a 4 GHz base frequency, and still 95 watts TDP. And here we really do have the miracle. The Miracle Class Silicon. Limited edition for a reason, Joel, and you'd know what that reason was had you watched any of my previous chiplets videos. Compare that i5-8600K to the i7-808 6K. 6 more threads and 400 MHz base clock at the same TDP. Yet I don't recall anyone questioning the existence of the 808 6K. So tell me again how this 400 MHz base clock increase with an additional 10 watts of power doesn't make sense. Back over at TechSpot, and Tim again could list several more strange things about this lineup that just don't sound right when measuring up the clock speeds and TDPs, and don't align with what AMD has done in the past. Like how there's a 4 GHz 8-core chip in this lineup at 95 watts, but then a 16-core chip at 4.3 GHz is only 135 watts. It doesn't seem to add up. As I already mentioned, the 4 GHz 8-core chip is actually 2 4-core chiplets, joined by the Infinity Fabric. They are also mid-range silicon compared to the ultra-high-end silicon of the 16-core. But is the 3850X really that incredible? Let's compare it to the 1800X. 95 watts at 3.6 GHz base clock and 4 GHz boost. And it was of course the flagship Ryzen of the first generation. What did we learn earlier about core counts? Basically double for free. That would be 16 cores and 32 threads at 3.6 GHz base and 4.1 GHz boost at 95 watts. The 3850X is a 135 watts TDP chip, 42% higher. 4.3 GHz is 19% higher than 3.6 GHz, and 5.1 GHz is 27.5% higher than 4 GHz. Is it really so hard to believe that some of the most cherry-picked silicon available is capable of 19% higher clock speeds with 42% higher TDP? How does that not add up? But back over at Extreme Tech, and AMD is not going to slash the price of a 16-core chip from $899 to $449. Ah god, not this one again. At what point, Joel, do you begin to realise that AMD's strategy is offering more cores at a similar price, not offering the same number of cores at a similar price? The latter is Intel's strategy. I think you're confusing the two. Intel can do that because they have 88% of the desktop market. If AMD wants to win mindshare and market share, they'll need to offer something more than a tiny little bit better than what they're doing now. The Threadripper ecosystem is also far more expensive than the Ryzen ecosystem. People who need or can use the extra cores of TR4 though will get even more cores at a similar price. The Reddit leak shows it, but my leak had no information on Threadripper. The last point in this utterly dreadful article, and Joe, I've used many of your articles in the past in my videos, as generally speaking I hold you in much higher regard than many in the tech press, is this. Collectively, you reckon these rumours make no sense. They predict unprecedented price cuts, and no, prices generally stay the same. The main difference is the new G series price increases and the new Ryzen 9 series returning to the much higher price point of 1st generation Zen because once again, there is no competition. Complete abandonment of AMD's established CPU feature distribution. This established CPU feature distribution basically means the old or current Ryzen 3 chips didn't have SMT. That's the reality of that statement. As I said, there are plenty of reasons for why they'd change it, but I will say that there is still a chance of perhaps the lowest end $99 chip being 6 cores and 6 threads. However, I personally feel the low clocks of that part and the 50 watts TDP will be the limiting factor there. There are other ways to upsell, apart from SMT on and off. Large clock jumps without the commensurate TDP increases. As I've just shown, everything is well within reason. Even the 3850X, the anniversary edition, is explained through simple binning in the exact same way it works for Intel's anniversary chip, the 8086K. Twice the core count on the same platform even when it makes no sense. No sense to who? I for one cannot wait to get my hands on a 3850X. Or at least the 3700X. I already have an 8-core 2700X, Joel. What else would I be interested in? Over $1,000 on Threadrippers? Quad-channel RAM and TR4 motherboards? I can't afford that. There's simply no chance I would buy that. $500 on a 3850X though? Yeah, I could just about stretch that far. For sure, the 3700X with 50% more cores and higher clock speeds at the same price again? You see how this is working, right? I already have AMD's fastest desktop chip, and yet I'm still interested in paying the same again, or even more, a year later. You think I'd be interested in 12 cores at $500 in that same way? That's a much tougher sell to me. 8 cores again at higher clocks and the same price, like you seem to think AMD should be doing? Nah, I'll pass on that. TDPs that must completely depart from the way AMD has reported and measured TDP with the first 2 generations of Ryzen. TDP values are utterly meaningless, as you just saw. And not incidentally, they predict that most of these products will be launched at CES, when we haven't heard a whisper of anything of the sort from AMD. I said announced at CES, not launched. Now what about this too good to be true stuff? Now it's been explained, absolutely. Does all this really seem too good to be true to you? I haven't told you a lot about the information and discussion I've had with my leaker on all this. I got a lot of stuff apart from the Ryzen 3000 and Navi information. Mostly stuff that had already happened and lined up nicely with some older leaks I had. Events that didn't actually come to pass. For example, RX Vega Rage. 7nm Vega GPUs for consumers were planned and pulled very late, because Navi makes more sense. One of my epic sources told me RX Vega cards were coming this year, and that was way back in February. And if you remember my Turing leak, Nvidia expected the Titan RTX to be around the same performance level as the RX Vega, on 7nm. In fact though, the fastest Vega would have fallen somewhere in between the 2080 and 2080 Ti, according to my latest leak. I also got a hint of a possible Athlon anniversary chip next year, but not very many more details on that. But the point here is, an awful lot of what my Ryzen 3000 and Radeon 3000 leaker told me appears to be true. There's no consumer 14nm IO die at least, and probably none period. So the chiplets simply connect to each other via Infinity Fabric. 3 different sources on that, and my new leaker is one of them. But guess what's most important? Is what happened after I launched my leak video. My next email from them was a request. The only request made of me during the entire process. Currently at 31 emails back and forth. 17 before I launched the video and 14 afterwards. That request was, could you clear up the confusion on when this information was given to you, since it was heavily compared to the Reddit leak, and I'd rather people knew your information came before the Reddit leak even existed. I can't change the video after it's uploaded. However, I pinned a comment on it and made a few comments on Reddit to the same effect. And obviously, I had a long hard think about why that request was made, and then I figured it out. I finally figured out what their agenda was. It was all about garnering public opinion. Your opinion on the current real specs, not the outdated Reddit specs. So a few days later, I wasn't at all surprised when I got an email with a clarification that the prices I had used in the video, especially for the RX 3000 series graphics cards, were more of a goal rather than the exact locked down launch MSRP. Though my leaker said that in over 10 years in the industry, they'd never seen prices change by more than $40 this close to launch, but that I shouldn't be surprised if the RX 3080 launches at say $290 instead of the $250 figure I'd been given, and perhaps we'd see some price changes on the Ryzen chips too. Maybe some down as well as up. Looking through the comments on the video, thousands of comments, there was one thing in particular that stood out. It was too good to be true. The prices especially were too good to be true, especially on the Navi cards. You know what they say, if something's too good to be true, it probably is. Well, here's another one. If you tell these companies that their products are too good to be true, then you make it so, and they'll make it so. Like a self-fulfilling prophecy. In that leak video, I put in a bunch of disclaimers about grains of salt and whatnot, but I should have also pointed out very clearly that anything can change right up until launch. But something as simple as prices can literally be changed at the click of a button, even after launch. While most of us had figured that one out by now, not everyone has. And if I failed you in that leak video, that was it. But hey, at least I didn't sell you out completely with the "it's too good to be true" mantra, especially when it's not. Or it wasn't. At no point before or after my video launched did my leaker suggest any of the hardware specs will be changed. Only the prices. I'll catch you later, guys.